Thanks to everybody who's here, who's joined us tonight. My name is Eleanor. I sit on the board of the California Garden and Landscape History Society, and I've been a member for about 5 years now. And I'm here to introduce both our organization, but also tonight's speaker, Thaïsa Way. And I do want to re-note at this time, just in case anybody missed it, that this program is being recorded tonight. So everybody be aware of that. Welcome to the first lecture of 2021 in CGLHS's online lecture series. Our second lecture series was just published. Our second lecture in the series was just published yesterday. It's scheduled for March 24th, and JC Miller will join us to talk about the modern landscapes of designer Robert Royston. And tickets are available now to members and will be made available to the general public next week. CGLHS will be charging $10 registration fee to non-members and a $5 donation or registration fee for members. And I encourage all of you to visit our website, cglhs.org, to learn more about our program and also to consider becoming a member, because that way you benefit from early registration and also the discounted rates, including rates to our annual conference. Members also receive quarterly editions of our journal, Eden, which is a really fabulous benefit, I think, and is one of the reasons I joined the organization. So moving on to tonight's program, our speaker is Thaïsa Way. Thaïsa is a landscape historian and the program director for the Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection in Washington, D.C. Her lecture looks at early 20th century practices that operated outside or were excluded from the landscape architecture field and how that's led the profession to define itself over time. This lecture will extend for approximately 40 minutes and will be followed by a short discussion. We'll save questions for the end. However, if you have thoughts that come up or questions about the content of the presentation, feel free to type those into the chat box at any time, and Janet and I will try and monitor those and get them in the queue for the discussion. We'll end a little after 7 p.m. Pacific time. And with that, I want to hand this over to Thaïsa so we can get started and say once again, thank you so much to everybody for being here.
Thank you. Sound okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. So first, obviously, thank you to Janet and Eleanor, but to everyone for putting this together. I want to say that what I'm presenting and sharing tonight is really a work in progress. And I can't think of a better group than this to share this work with. So I'm really honored to be able to present this work, explore a different way of thinking about the history of landscape architecture. And I really look forward to your questions and comments, and would just say, if we don't get to your questions or comments this evening, or you think of something later, I'm pretty easy to find online in my email, and feel free to send me questions, because this is really a topic and a narrative that I think is important, that we'll collectively work on over the next couple, probably decades. So Virginia Woolf famously argued that if a woman were given a room of her own and money, then, quote, the opportunity will come and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on the body which she has so often laid down. While Woolf emphasizes a room within a house, elsewhere she writes of a garden as a site of imagination and reflection. In her book, Kew Gardens of 1927, Woolf suggests the garden is an opportunity to express a personal vision, explore the process of perception, and provide oblique social commentary, end of quote. Might the garden offer an alternative to Woolf's room of one's own? Might our mother's garden be a place where women sought their own and their communities' liberation and freedom? Indeed, women at the turn of the century transformed the garden from an instrument intended for nourishment to a tool for creating art and constructing civic leadership. This talk today suggests the call for a broader inquiry into the experiences of overlapping constellations of women and questions of gender and race in the shaping of the practice of landscape architecture through the garden. But why the garden to explore gender and race in design? Too often historians, and I think design historians, me included, have been complicit, work backwards to identify a lineage from whence specific individuals and ideas directly arise. And yet we know that is not how people, culture, or ideas emerge. They take shape out of the cacophony of life. Instead, I propose we consider the multiple, messy, and often conflicting narratives that histories reveal, and consider how those stories challenge, alter, and confirm both known, new, and alternative narratives. Instead of asking, how did we come to narrowly define landscape architecture? What if we look to the past to reveal the abundance of practices, places, and ideas, and from that began to understand how we have come to select some trajectories, reject others, and challenge and alter yet others. Building on the work of many, this approach to history suggests that our past is not a logical or even comprehensible narrative, but a messy, layered, complicated series of stories from which we might learn about ourselves and our place in the world, as well as, I hope, imagine a better, fuller, more just future. Why gardens? Gardens offer the opportunity to explore the everyday and the extraordinary, familiar and unknown. Gardens offer one lens to more fully interrogate the history of landscape architecture because they are, in fact, very important places and practices in most any culture. They were critical to the early design practices of most every landscape architect. And yet today, landscape architecture so often belittles the garden as either trite or elitist. Gardens have been written out of the formal design history for reasons that support, I would argue, a clear agenda of white, male, and European dominance. How did this come to be, and how has this shaped what we think is possible and good? Oh, but that was my first time moving ahead too fast. Furthermore, I focus on gardens as a window into women's experiences as they navigated communities at the intersections of gender and race, while acknowledging that class also contributes to their worldview. In building a counter-narrative, we question the emergence of landscape architecture, not as an inevitable profession of design, but as one socially constructed through the application of gendered and racialized views of who should shape the land and place and what it meant to be a professional. Now, honestly, my talk today is far too short to grapple with all these questions, so I'm going to lay out what I hope are some provocative stories, some relatively unacknowledged, others better known, but I hope to challenge. I read the garden as a place of subversive agency, as women turned what was deemed inconsequential space into a place of radical engagement, pushing the boundaries of gender and race, while simultaneously responding to the constraints of a racist and sexist society. Women experience the garden as an intellectual and material place where they have found dignity, beauty, and strength. As Bell Hooks writes, quote, "To tend the earth is always then to tend our destiny, our freedom, and our hope." This is evoked equally in Alice Walker's description of how, quote, "guided by my heritage of a love of beauty and a respect for strength, in search of my mother's garden, I found my own." In such gardens, women have nurtured their creative spirit through the act of creating a garden to nourish the soul. The garden is traditionally described as an enclosed and cultivated place where one dwells and tills, a place that retains a hold on the human imagination. Such a capacious definition may well be why the garden remains such a powerful space and idea. Frances Hodgson Burnett's Secret Garden of 1911 describes the garden as a place with, quote, "bulbs and sweet smelling things, but mostly roses," offering, as Woolf suggests, an escape, quote, "from the common sitting room where one can view the sky too and the trees or whatever it may be in themselves." The garden becomes the means for an artist to thrive, as both Woolf and Walker describe the human agony of being incapable of nurturing one's creative spirit, a suffering that both writers have argued led to insanity and perhaps even the claims of witchcraft among women. While Woolf seeks the room to write, Walker looks to her mother in the garden to cultivate her soul. Walker describes how her mother tends to her flowers, becoming, quote, radiant almost to the point of being invisible, except as creator, hand, and eye. She is involved in work her soul must have. The garden in this case clearly stands in for Woolf's room, nurturing the artist. Now, a gendered reading of gardens reveals a long and complex history, and there are a number of historians that have done a remarkable job of that history. The earliest known garden book, published specifically for women, William Lawson's The Country Housewife's Garden of 1618, emphasized the essential nature of a productive garden cultivated by an industrious housewife. By the early 18th century in Great Britain, gardening was less about production and increasingly viewed as a leisure activity for elite women. Charles Evelyn's The Ladies' Recreation, 1707, described how women might garden without soiling their hands or challenging their intellectual capacity, instead focusing on how to lay out lawns and orangeries and how to best place sculpture. Such ornamental pleasures contrasted with the mundane activities of sowing, planting, propagating flowers, knowledge he assumed every country dame might hold, but elite women need not pursue. What we see here in this image is Celia Thaxter's garden, illustrating her within the trope of the woman as a lovely persona in a lovely garden, we assume writing lovely things. Such gendered views of the garden and gardening would both constrain and afford transgressions as women expanded the boundaries of their knowledge and engagement in the garden. This gendered view of gardens would open the door to women as writers, including Louise Shelton's The Seasons in a Flower Garden, 1906, Grace Tabor's Suburban Gardens, 1913, or Ruth Dean's The Livable House, Its Garden in 1917. Each focus on women gardeners as caretakers. As landscape historian Diane Harris has noted, books and essays by women on gardening contribute to the formation of a network of women's specialized knowledge and support. There have also been, in addition to these, important and seminal books that stretch the boundaries of women as passive gardeners, including Elsa Raymond's American Plants for American Gardens, 1929, that one might argue is one of the earlier treatises on what we today call ecological design, or Silent Spring. I probably don't need to explain that to this group, or Michelle Obama's book and celebration of the garden. The garden, even in literature, has presented a far more diverse and rich reading than we often acknowledge. Gardens were equally significant in the lives of both enslaved and free African-American women. Diane Glave's Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming the African-American Environmental Heritage, narrates how the act of transforming yards served as a means for enslaved women to claim authority over her place, as well as setting such places apart from those of the slaveholders. They, quote, created distinctly African-American spaces that simultaneously mimicked nature and rejected Euro-American control. Recent scholarship confirms what many have known from their own families. Enslaved women modified and interpreted spaces of sustenance, comfort, joy, and sometimes profit as a means of conserving their humanity and their communities. And after the Civil War, these women used the garden again as a means of making and claiming space, as described by Jacqueline Jones in her critical work. Gardens further served as sites where traditions of environmental stewardship were cultivated. The gardens in these narratives, thus, is not a passive place, but a place of resistance as sustenance. The garden was and remains an integral space in what can be called the home place, whose making Bell Hooks again describes as a place of resistance. Quote, "This task of making home place was not simply a matter of Black women providing service. It was about the construction of a safe place where Black people could affirm one another and by so doing, heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist domination. We could not learn to love or respect ourselves in the culture of white supremacy on the outside. It was there on the inside, in that home place, most often created and kept by Black women, that we had the opportunity to grow and to develop, to nurture our spirits, end of quote. Home place, which I think of as inclusive of the garden, as a place of resistance, was one where one might regain lost perspective, give life new meaning, that space where we return for renewal and self-recovery, where we can heal our wounds and become whole. Again, bell hooks. Finally, the garden offered women the potential to turn a profit of their own, another form of sustenance and resistance. Enslaved and free Black women, as well as rural white women, sold produce to support their families. Anna B. Warner would describe the lucrative potential of the garden in her book, Miss Tiller's Vegetable Garden, and the money she made by it, of 1873. Marion Cran's 1918 book, The Garden of Ignorance, The Experience of a Woman in a Garden, told of how she trained her daughter to be able to earn wages from the house and garden labors. Now, the garden as a place of radical gardening is beautifully manifested in the garden of Harlem Renaissance poet, gardener, librarian, and activist Anne Bethel Spencer in Lynchburg, Virginia, as shown in the photograph of Anne here and her husband, Edward, in the back of the garden. Spencer's home and garden served as her home place, a gathering place for friends, including many of the Harlem literati, including Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, Mary McLeod Bethune, Gwendolyn Brooks, and James Weldon Johnson, who helped her publish her first poem in the journal The Crisis. Anne Spencer was an activist and played a role in the founding of the Lynchburg chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and in the resistance to Virginia's Jim Crow laws by cultivating her life as an artist gardener in her home place. Moving to the Queen Anne style home built by her husband Edward in 1902, Spencer planted first a small vegetable garden. As her children grew older, and I suspect that meant she had some gardening help, she developed her garden and in 1924 expanded it to the street at the end of the property. Spencer, whose father was born into enslavement and a mother, a descendant of enslaved people, named her garden with its own writing cottage, Eden Crawl, combining her and Edward's name and the term crawl, the Afrikaans word for enclosure as well as dwelling. She designed, planted, and tended to her garden, while Edward built the structures, including the pergola, the arbor, the pond, and the writing studio that you can see here. Over her lifetime, the garden became a fusion of recycled architectural elements and high art garden designs. Spencer planted local plants, often collected on trips to the countryside, and exotic plants, many given her as gifts. Taking a special place in the garden was the cast iron head of an African prince, a work of the Igbo tribe of West Africa, a gift of W.E.B. Du Bois. The abundance of flowers and brightly colored gates, arbors, and garden furniture, as well as her use of recycled materials, may well be reminiscent of a more typical Southern rural garden, as evoked by Alice Walker's description, as well as those by Vaughn Sill's photographs, who I show periodically here. Spencer's garden was both a work of art, a retreat, and a place of community gathering. Described as a feminist interested in womanist themes, Spencer's artistic production, both her poetry and her garden, suggests an intimately woven tapestry tended to over a lifetime, the two practices, gardening and writing, nurturing one another. Spencer's poems depict her garden as an essential source of inspiration and beauty, a sacred space and a retreat, as well as a metaphor for transformation, wounding, and healing. She wrote about her garden in the poem, Any Wife to Any Husband, suggesting how the poet and the gardener will live beyond her as an artist. This small garden is half my world. I am nothing to it when all is said. I plant the thorn and kiss the rose, but they will grow when I am dead. I read Spencer's garden as a radical space of life, as it simultaneously functions as a private home place, a place of artistic and horticultural creation, a muse for her art, and equally important, a setting for the intellectual engagements of a community of artists, writers, and activists of the Harlem Renaissance. And I should note that's her writing cottage down there on the bottom right. The garden was not only important for individuals, it contributed to the broader social efforts that we call the progressive era. An early effort in village improvement that is often cited was led by Mary Hopkins Goodrich and the Laurel Hill Association, formed for the purpose of beautifying Stockbridge, Massachusetts in 1853. The goal of the association to improve and ornament the streets and public grounds of the village. During this progressive era, as guardians of virtue and morality, women were thought to be naturally associated with the work of cleansing the municipal, state, and federal houses, and to upgrade the quality of life for Americans. Jane Addams, seen here meeting with children in the bottom right, in her 1907 essay, Utilization of Women in City Government, describes the intersecting concerns of good government and good housekeeping that frame the efforts as appropriate for women's leadership. This authority granted women in the domain of housekeeping and moral values, provided, if perhaps unintentionally, women a visible and active place in the public community. Now, Annette Hoyt Flanders, 1887 to 1946, designed the gardens for a classic modern garden at Chicago's Century of Progress International Exposition and America's Little House in New York City, which we'll see next. She used the projects to promote a vision of America as a nation of small gardens, where each gardener could, quote, make a more permanent contribution to the cause of beauty. She sought to teach taste to middle-class homeowners by illustrating, quote, the logical sequence in which things should be done to develop property practically, beautifully, and economically. She designed a classic modern garden for Chicago's Century of Progress Expo in 1934 as a model that could be replicated by middle-class families, or so claimed the magazine. However, rarely if ever discussed is how the garden reflected the dominant view of modern suburban gardens for white families, with an emphasis on privacy and hygiene, an approach that would grow in the coming decades. With its clean geometries and simple color palette, the garden defied inscriptions of alternative cultures or other kinds of garden narratives. Soon after the Chicago exhibit, Flanders designed the garden for America's Little House. Better Homes in America campaign, first launched in 1922 by the President's Advisory Council on Housing, sponsored model homes throughout the United States. Flanders' garden was visited by over 145,000 individuals. She provided visitors a budget that illustrated the affordability, again, of such a modern garden. And the garden was described by the writer Pearl Buck as, quote, an oasis among the towering skyscrapers, creating by placing simply a layer of topsoil 2 feet thick over discarded bricks, broken bottles, and other rubbish. This description suggests the ideal of a garden to transform the detritus of the city, even an apparently abandoned plot, read slum potential, into a place of beauty, read cultivated. The colonial revival garden and house stood in contrast to the city. This juxtaposition emphasized the role of the house and garden to counter urban blight, a perspective that echoed the village improvement advocates as they sought to reimagine the city as collections of well-tended gardens. Similar to the Century Garden, this garden suggested a specific white colonial affiliation in its use of the popular colonial revival style. This style spoke to the predominantly white audience, actively engaged in literally whitewashing the history of the colonial era of North America. Flanders' work as both a designer and in her essays for popular magazines emphasized the capacity of the average American to design a garden that would improve their daily lives and in turn their community, but all the time promoting a racialized view of what it meant to be a good community, a good garden, and a good city. That is just part of the story. Anne Fiora Scott has noted and written extensively on Black women who had been organizing in their communities since the late 18th century, with the Female Benevolent Society of St. Thomas in Philadelphia, formed in 1793, in order to, quote, secure shoes and clothing for women and children who had been rescued by the Underground Railroad. Another group, the Colored Female Religious and Moral Society in Salem, Massachusetts, was created in 1818. Black women's literary clubs began to show up as early as 1831 with the Female Literary Society of Philadelphia. After 1865, Black women increased their organizational activities within churches to care for their communities through programs of mutual aid and support. Between 1880 and 1920, Black women in Indianapolis, Indiana, were part of 500 clubs engaged in community service. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was formed in July 1896 at the first annual convention of the National Federation of Afro-American Women by a merger of the National Federation of African American Women and the Women's Era Club of Boston and the Colored Women's League of Washington, D.C. Being a member of a women's club offered these Black women greater acknowledgement as leaders and stewards in their communities. By 1900, a great majority of Black communities had women's clubs. By 1910, in proportion to population size, African American women clubs outpaced white women's clubs in the number of clubs created. These women drew on the goals of the village improvement clubs through the design of model gardens intended to teach taste to the masses and in turn improve the public realm through attention to garden aesthetics. Emerging from the women's club movement in both Black and white communities, garden clubs emerged as another important space in the early 20th century. The first acknowledged garden club was created by a small group of white women friends in 1891 as the Ladies' Garden Club of Athens, Georgia. By 1913, white women were organizing a national federation of garden clubs, the Garden Club of America, and in 1929, the National Council of State Gardens. These garden clubs focus on three core purposes: to strengthen women's role as a protector of the domestic life and home, as well as the defender of values, morals, and patriotism, to preserve the nation's history and to improve the standards of gardens, both private and public, throughout the nation. And yet I would note that in 1900, there was an incredible debate on whether this garden federation might also allow Black women garden clubs to join. Martha Brooks Hutchinson was a professional landscape architect and member of the American Society of Landscape Architects, but her legacy, as historian Roxy Thorin has described, was grounded in her approach to the Garden Club of America as a social and institutional platform for her social agenda, while using her home, Murchiston Farm, as a physical platform to model good garden design and stewardship. After studying landscape architecture at MIT, Hutchinson opened her office in 1902 and until 1910 maintained a firm based in Boston and New York. She was a founding member in 1913 of the Somerset Hills Garden Club. Hutchinson's intent in pursuing a career was to, quote, bring about positive social change through landscape design. She considered landscape design as culturally essential force for civic betterment and encouraged clubs to open their meetings to a broader audience so as to reach a greater community of women. And as you can see here in the top right, during World War I, she invited the Women's Land Army of America, an organization addressing labor shortages, to her farm to learn improved agricultural techniques and practices. Hutchinson encouraged the white garden clubs to create, quote, the finest gardens which America can produce, to demonstrate better standards for the public. She designed Murchison Farm as a demonstration garden, and her book, The Spirit of the Garden, dedicated to those with a progressive spirit in their concern for the fine art of garden making, was again intended to teach good taste. Hutchinson's belief in the popular thought that gardening with American plants would foster assimilation by immigrants into the American landscape and nation. And drawing thus on her network of garden club members, she advocated for the use of native plants that could be acquired locally, perhaps even shared, in contrast to exotics that must be purchased and often did not thrive. Recognizing the force of class, i.e. money, Hutchinson wrote that garden club demonstration gardens were far too expensive for most families, and instead members should demonstrate ecologically appropriate gardens that would be more affordable and thus more easily emulated by a broader community. Hutchinson framed her design approach to consider gardens as community-oriented, modeling how women might lead with a social agenda. However, she remained silent on the questions of race and immigration. Black women's clubs were also increasingly important in their support for communities and to empower women as informed citizens. Black women leaders and their clubs focus on education, health, and community improvements while developing organizing and leadership skills. There were a number of ways in which Black women took on important roles using gardens as a means of community empowerment and improvement. Women served as home demonstration agents starting in 1912 when Annie Peters was appointed as a federal agent in Oklahoma on January 1st, 1912, with Maddie Holmes, another Black woman hired only months later in Virginia. The home demonstration program was a part of a federal program established in the early 20th century that for African-American farm families may well have been seen as an extension of an earlier Tuskegee annual farmers conference that featured sessions devoted specifically to women's issues, including gardens. The agents were assigned to help families, particularly rural families, to improve their homes through advancement in the community, the field, and the garden. These efforts were contemporaneous with increased, if still limited, access for Black women to attend Black colleges and universities, where by 1935, more women were enrolled than men. These colleges offered courses not merely in agriculture or home economics, but in landscape design and horticulture. There is sadly very little that I know of yet, and I'm always hoping somebody's going to prove me wrong on this, in scholarship on the Negro garden clubs. I'm hoping a young student here today is inspired. This needs extensive work. Paul Mullins has shown how there was indeed an emphasis on the built environment among the earlier Black women's clubs, even if they were not originally focused on the garden. This includes the Detroit Gardens Council, a Black women's organization started in 1924 as a branch to the Women's City Council, whose first project was to improve the 8 Mile Road district of Detroit in line with village improvements and focus on the power of landscape in the public realm. At the same time, there emerged what were then called Negro garden clubs for women. In 1931, a community of Black women in Dayton, Ohio, founded the Delphinium Garden Club, which was led by Remitha Ford, a local social worker. The Negro Garden Clubs of Virginia was founded in 1932 with 7 chapters, expanding by the 1940s to 65 chapters. In Indianapolis, Black women formed their own Delphinium Garden Club in 1938, remaining active for another 35 years. A 1963 history of the Negro Garden Clubs of Virginia, shared its commitment to its, quote, commitment to develop genuine appreciation for the healing power of nature's bounty and beauty in a perplexed world. The club members promoted the garden as creative work, nourishing the soul, in addition to a place of refuge and a source of sustenance, as well as the benefits of gardening as an activity and a body of knowledge. The garden clubs organize workshops, tours, and book clubs to share and disseminate knowledge, as well as community building. For some, including the Club of Virginia, the focus also extended to the purview of, quote, improving race relations, suggesting the strong connections between the club missions and efforts to be recognized as acknowledged citizens and leaders. The Negro Garden Club's handbook's essay quote, titled 10 Years of Progress by the Negro Garden Clubs of Virginia, noted that, quote, we have succeeded in getting the majority of Negroes to beautify their homes and yards. At the same time, these citizens have become civic conscious and have become voters. Gardens offered an instrument of engagement, leadership, and eventually radical change. The garden became much more than a plot of tilled ground, as it served to provide a space between the private domestic sphere and the public civic spheres of engagement and leadership. It was amid discourses on civil improvements, garden design, and the role of women and the questions of race in a new century that landscape architecture emerged. With increased public recognition and new educational programs, visibility of practitioners, the profession was officially launched in 1899 with the founding of the American Society of Landscape Architects. This made official the work of a small community of practitioners, white men and women. Of the founding practitioners, 5 studied horticulture or worked in nurseries, 2 were trained as park designers, 3 educated in civil engineering, and 1 an architect. Beatrix Jones, that you see here, later Beatrix Farron, was one of the founding members, with Elizabeth Bullard from Connecticut elected to the association just a few months later. Early practitioners such as Beatrix Farron, Elizabeth Bullard, and Annette McCrae were, like Olmsted, H.W. Cleveland, and Charles Platt, essentially self-taught, and some able to apprentice with senior practitioners. In the 19th century, co-educational degree programs in landscape gardening and later landscape architecture after the turn of the century were established at universities such as Cornell, the University of Illinois, University of Iowa, Michigan State, and MIT's short-lived degree program, primarily land-grant universities. Lowthorpe School of Landscape Architecture for Women opened in 1901, just as a Harvard program was being launched for men only. The Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women was opened in 1910, and the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture for Women in 1915. And again, I would emphasize that the historically Black colleges established in the 1890s by an extension of the land grant program also taught gardening, horticulture, as well as agriculture and farming techniques. Hundreds of women designed gardens in the first half of the 20th century. Women from all kinds of backgrounds. Some did this work through their garden clubs and social organizations. Some led small businesses catering to neighbors. Some worked nationally, some worked quietly. White women were able to enter the professional community of landscape architects using the garden as a bridge to a professional practice in ways that have come to define the profession of landscape architecture today. Beatrix Jones, later Farron, was born to a well-connected family in New York City that came of 5 generations of garden lovers. Educated by tutors in the arts and humanities, Beatrix sought out Charles Sprague Sargent, curator of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, with whom she studied botany, horticulture, and arboriculture. She launched her design practice in 1896 in New York City, serving primarily members of her social constellation. While her repertoire included botanical gardens, university campuses, and public gardens, her best-known designs are Dumbarton Oaks for Robert and Mildred Bliss in Washington, D.C., the Eyrie for Abby Aldridge, Rockefeller in Seal Harbor, Maine, and the Willard Strait Garden on Long Island. Farron determined early in her career to call herself a landscape gardener, suggesting the significance that she placed on the practice of design as one centered on gardens and gardening. This approach to design was nowhere more evident than in her design and stewardship of the Garden of Dumbarton Oaks, where I am really honored to have a job at the moment. At Dumbarton Oaks, Farron, between 1921 and 1947, designed the 53-acre landscape, documented in over 1,226 drawings and sketches. The European influences can be identified in the broader layout of the landscape with its strong axial vistas evoking the French gardens of Le Notre, generous lawns and trees reminiscent of English landscapes, and enclosed garden rooms recalling the Italian Renaissance gardens. Nevertheless, the garden is an American work of art reflected in how the design fits the ground, the weaving together of formal and informal designs, and the attention to an active, even athletic use of the landscape. There's not the strict European division of formal near the house and informal farther away, but rather a rhythmic integration of formal and informal spaces that can be argued define a distinctly American garden design. In the gardens designed by Farron, Hutchinson, and Ann Spencer, we can identify both shared and distinct experiences of women in garden design, suggesting a constellation shaping early practices in the profession that was more inclusive than the profession acknowledged in the coming decades. Nevertheless, the profession as a community would soon seek to erase the garden as an essential part of landscape architecture. To the frustration of many in the ASLA, the public continued to conflate landscape architecture and the craft of gardening, a conflation that leading landscape architects found deeply troubling. The public did not seem to recognize, according to the professionals, the difference between a gardener and a landscape architect. Many landscape architects thus sought to disengage their practice from gardening and horticulture as practiced by women, to more closely align with architecture and engineering. They sought to define gardening as menial manual labor or a leisurely hobby. One can't help but ask questions of gender and race as these professionals defied a design practice intimately engaged with environment, nature, and land that was at the core of the work of individuals such as Hutchinson, Spencer, or Farrand, or in the writings of Alice Walker or Zora Neale Hurston. Those who had created a garden of one's own found that while it might still nurture the creative spirit, it could no longer serve as a generative place for transgressions into the public realm, as garden design was relegated to the trivial. After being interned during World War II, May Arbogast was the first Japanese-American woman to complete a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley in 1953, where she would later teach until 1966 and practice for decades. Although African-American landscape architect David Williston established the first Black-owned landscape architecture firm in Washington, D.C. in 1898, he was never elected as a fellow of the ASLA. Karen Phillips, graduating with a BLA from the University of Georgia in 1975, would be the first Black woman to be elected as an American Society of Landscape Architects Fellow in 1998. Nearly a century after the founding of the ASLA. This is not a matter of pipelines, but a question of how the profession sought to define its work and its contributions. With that now left as a question rather hanging, I admit, I would conclude to note that as Woolf contended that women must have ownership and presence in their own space, to create art, gardens became critical and generative spaces for women. Drawing from Bell Hook's essay, Earthbound on Solid Ground, women understood how, quote, reclaiming our history, our relationship to nature, to farming in America, and proclaiming the humanizing restorative of living in harmony with nature so that the earth can be our witness is meaningful resistance. This, end of quote. This resistance manifested for many women in the roles and futures as artists, scientists, teachers, writers, and garden designers in ways that we have yet to fully acknowledge or understand. Now, the narrative I've composed here seeks to expand the legacies of women's contributions to place and culture through collective stories, lineages, and networks of women as gardeners and garden designers, not in order to answer all the questions, but in order to expand the histories of the built environment through questions of race, gender, class, and questions of identity. The garden room of one's own, where women from many backgrounds nurtured the creative spirit by creating art, significantly, I argue, contributed to the early practice of landscape architecture. And that is worthy of further study to understand the past and then to be able to imagine a more just and beautiful future. And with that, I want to hear what you think.
Thanks, Thaïsa. Can you hear me?
I can. And do you want me to stop sharing or do you want me to leave that up?
I think that can stay up.
Okay.
Oh, great. I was just going to ask Janet to start my video. Here I am. So we received a lot of questions in the chat during the second part of your
Excellent.
lecture. So
Oh, good.
yeah, I think we have some good discussion points. We also received a few people who just chimed in with their own resources and suggestions for further studies. So
Oh, awesome. So let's make sure we save the chat so that I can
yes,
look through all of that later, because
okay,
half the reason I do this is hoping people will send me
definitely.
links and things. So
I
that'd be
also
great.
want to follow up. So I
Excellent.
have my own copy that I've just been tracking, and we'll extract the chat as well. Well,
Great.
so let me start with the first question, which is a really good one, and it was when you were talking about the American House in New York,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and Petra put a question into the chat asking if you know of any colonial. She said colonial era, but I'm assuming this is colonial revival era
Uh-huh.
gardens that originally designed in a whitewashing effort have gone through restoration preservation projects that work to reveal a more honest depiction of race and gender at the time. Do you know of any
Oh, yeah.
associated resources that we could use as templates for approaching this type of preservation project to engage with history?
Yeah, so fantastic first question. And so what I'd say to you is absolutely, and there's a whole range. I mean, there's a range from Williamsburg, right, which is the, the heart of colonial revival. But they have done a remarkable job in the last 20 years of slowly understanding. It started with a very simple slavery tour. But they have been rethinking their gardens to think through not just how much colonial revival erased the Black communities and the role of enslaved structures there, but also erased the real life of anyone. I mean, lo and behold, we didn't all run around with petticoats and unclean streets. So they've really been thinking. So I actually think Williamsburg, believe it or not, is a really interesting place. But there's also been, so that's one sort of, if you really want to think of the epitome of colonial revival and some of their important work. But there's also been amazing work at places like Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, which is now increasingly interpreted as a Black landscape, realizing, right, that there are 120 some enslaved people living on the mountain and 6 Jeffersons of his family. So it's a different, and so they've been doing, so some of those bigger places, but probably the other places, the place that I think has the most interesting, and I encourage everyone to look, is Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, which is actually interpreting itself not as a white plantation, but as a Black landscape. And what their whole interpretation is about the life of the enslaved people on the plantation. And they're using art and all sorts of other ways to bring in stories that I think are fantastic. So I think, the answer to you is, I think there's a lot of work. It is still very much in the making. And I would say that it is both in the making because we need to learn more. I was listening earlier today, one of our resources that people don't know about is during the WPA, one of the things, one of the big projects was to interview very elderly Black men and women who had been children when emancipation happened. So in the late 30s, there were people, right, who were still alive, but they had been young. But that is firsthand memory. And you can go, and there's something like 128 long interviews and other things. So that's a source. So one issue is everyone's struggling with what are the sources. We can't just make it up, right? And the second thing is, quite honestly, helping, and this is where all of you come in, is helping the public understand what these changes are. I'm sure you've read about the plantation tours and the pushback as plantations talk about enslaved communities and people saying, I didn't come here to, hear about violence. I came here to see, Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler, right, do their thing. And it's our role as historians, I think, to help bring the public along. So I think it's a two-way. It's the places, but it's also our communal work to help people think about why these stories are worth listening to. And as somebody else has said earlier in this talk about the interviews, it's not all about violence. The enslaved communities found ways, Black Joy found ways to make their lives meaningful. And it's important to acknowledge that and their own resistance. So that's a long-winded answer. But yes, there are some places I'd be happy to send. But I think if you look at most of the good places are beginning to take this on. But you might start with Williamsburg, just because it was so deeply defined the colonial revival. So their willingness to take on a broader narrative, I think, is important to acknowledge.
And I assume that that model home in Manhattan is gone.
Yeah, all the model homes are gone, so I can't say just, but yeah. Needless to say, that little colonial house did not win out over big skyscrapers. I actually tried to get a photograph once of the site, but it's a big canyon. It just looks like the side of a building.
Well, that does actually lead right into the next question we received, which I believe was about model gardens, but also could have been about garden clubs, gardens that clubs formed to create or maintain. Is where are these model gardens located, and have any evidence been found of Black women's clubs gardens in the Western U.S.?
Oh, so I can answer the first and then give you a not very satisfying answer on the second. So most of the model gardens for garden, so there are two sets. There are official model gardens like Better Homes campaign did. None of those exist because they were all temporary. They were like expos and such, right? So you went and you saw the garden. The one in New York, there were 4 apple trees, I think, that produced like 137 apples, and people were thrilled, but then it all got taken away. Then the model gardens that the garden clubs do, those were generally their private gardens. And that is the genesis of things like Virginia Garden Week, where there's a week in April where you can go visit all of these private Virginia gardens. And it was very much, it was private gardens. So some of them exist, but not as model gardens. They just exist as the continual garden. So they didn't necessarily have, for example, we were talking earlier about the demonstration gardens, which is a whole nother kind of garden, a demonstration garden where it's done in the public realm. And some of those, and that's a different history. So a little mixed up. In terms of the West, I will tell you that I have spent years trying to pull some of this together around the Black garden clubs. I know they did garden visits, so they had, they each did gardens that they would show, and they would do the garden visits and the garden tours, and they would go visit gardens. There were actually some white and Black garden clubs that would come together to do these tours of one another. They wouldn't tour together, but they would open each other's gardens to each other to go on separate days. But I don't know of anything on the West Coast, but it's been very hard to even get the stuff in places like Indiana, where I know there were 500 clubs. So I haven't lost hope that there is archives on the West Coast. And I'm hoping one of those chats is telling me where there's this incredible box of materials.
Well, we did just get another question. If you could say a little bit more about gardens as sites of resistance in terms of race and gender.
Yeah.
How did that materialize?
So I think one of the important things about gardens is, and I'm going to say this in the context that I think today we tend to think of gardens as pretty places. There's charm, somebody, so-and-so's garden is so lovely. But they were actually places because, well, for women in particular, I think they were places of resistance because they could actually do things in the garden that they wouldn't otherwise. So first of all, they could work hard. They could, in fact, soil their hands in the soil. I used to laugh that, the nice thing about a garden is you can take risks, because if the plant dies, you put it in the compost, right? It's not the end of the world, different than children, right? So I think they were a place of resistance because you could actually engage in activities. But the other really important piece is, remember that gardens are often in sight of the public. Unless you have your garden way out in your backyard and you have lots of trees around it and no one can see, and often people can see. And so it's what I call liminal space in between, where you're on your private, but like the model gardens, you're in your private, but then you're opening it to people can see. So you're making a statement about your role. And I think because gardens, I also just think gardens have become in cultures all around the world, shaping place is a very human activity. To shape a place, it's like homemaking and nesting. The thing is, inside a building, no one else sees it unless you invite them in. The garden is a semi-public making of home. And I think that's a powerful activity to take in, because you're essentially announcing to your neighbors or walkers by what you consider home, a home place. And you control that space.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, but yeah, and I would, when you read Jamie Kincaid, or you read different people who, Elizabeth Lawrence, and talk about, that they're talking about their garden. It's not like a collection of books, where I love my books. And I love the collection of books. The garden is the composition, right? It's not, we know the people who are just into horticulture and like have the amazing collection of every rose or delphinium or dahlia possible. Those aren't necessarily the beautiful gardens that we walk in and we realize, oh, this is somebody's soul that's here. And I think that's a form of resistance. And that's the form of resistance that I think we've lost, we've forgotten to allow that, to recognize that. Does that help at all? I'm happy to.
I think so. Yeah, that's a really powerful answer, that the resistance is found just in our own power.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and yeah. And then I would also just say, I mean, if you think about it, having a relationship with the natural world, where you're shaping the natural world to meet your creative soul and spirit, that's powerful stuff.
Controlling not just ourselves, but our environment.
Yeah. And then for other people, I mean, most gardeners, not all, but most gardeners, right, want people to visit. We cut the hedge down a little bit in front so people can peek in, right? We do things. Some of us put up a big hedge so no one can see us, but I think the most avid gardeners want somebody to see their work of art.
Yeah, that's really great. We have one other question. It's 2 minutes to 7. So
Okay.
I'll try and fit this one in.
And I'll try not to talk so long.
Well, people are sticking around, so I think talk as long as you want. People can leave whenever they like. True. And I'll just put in one more plug to visit our website before everybody heads out at 7 o'clock. But the one other question I wanted to be sure and get out there tonight was from Melissa. And she's asking if women's clubs of the late 19th and early 20th century have any roots in or connections to the City Beautiful movement.
So the answer is yes, in that the City Beautiful movement is part of this larger sort of progressive era, making cities better, livable. However, what I would say is, in many ways, the garden clubs and many of the women's improvement clubs. So first of all, I'd say City Beautiful in some way borrowed from earlier women's organizations to clean up the city. But the City Beautiful movement is, frankly, a much more elite view, stylistically defined, to put a certain very European, and I think we could easily say today, white supremacist view on the city. And I think the garden clubs and the women's, not to everyone, but to most, were more broadly thinking. And I'm sure somebody wants to argue with me on that. But I think the garden clubs were really interested, not necessarily in were they not interested? It's just, it's a different scale and a different group of people. But I'm thinking, just to be clear, I'm thinking of the City Beautiful, like coming out of the White City in the 1893 Chicago Fair, and this very stylistic, big, grand, we are the new Rome sort of grand piece. And frankly, landscape architecture wasn't totally, I mean, Olmsted designs that, but he also designs the wooded aisle, and he's doing other work, Biltmore at the same time. So there's, I think landscape architects are more nuanced than the City Beautiful movement necessarily reflected.
Well, thank you so much for engaging with
Absolutely.
these questions and helping us facilitate this discussion. And I've
Yeah.
saved the chat, so I will provide that to you.
That's awesome. And thank you. And really, thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you for any comments you made. And do send me any thoughts, sources. That'd be awesome. And listen
Really
to
enjoyed
JC
it.
Miller next month. He's great. And Royston's work is fantastic. So,
Yeah, somebody noted that there's an error on our website about registering
oh,
for that, and it looks like Janet is working on getting that fixed. So members should be able to register tonight or tomorrow. Sorry about that.
that sounds great.
And thank you to everybody for being here. We really appreciate it.
All right.